welcome, warmest welcome to this special occasion. But I must extend welcome not simply to the persons who are here present, that is, my colleagues who are led by our acting Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Albert Benjamin, and our dear students, but also to our online attendees from the Mico alumni overseas and all friends and well-wishers who are tuned in online. And I must also say special welcome to our president, Dr. Asburn Pinnock, who is making his way down the stairs. Today is indeed a very special one, but the week itself is special too, because the Mico is celebrating all of 187 years. Yeah, clap the Mico now. It's a week of fun and sobriety. Yesterday, we had the pep rally, and of course, which house won? Did we hear that? hello, Rogers. Of course, the other houses did very well too. And the Guild had a Guild Fest Carnival, didn't they? Yes. Today, it is Research Spotlight Day. And this morning, we awarded 5 special members of the faculty who are engaged in research heavily. We had a research presentation as well that has implications for the wider Jamaica and beyond. At this juncture, we will be having a seminar, but more about that. Later at 3, we will have the Nathan Brissett Awards presentation, so you need to be there too, you know. Yes. Tomorrow morning at 10:30, Mr. President is all smiles because we're having the commissioning of the, not tomorrow, Thursday. Yes, we're having the commissioning of the well. And so we expect you to be there, water everywhere, and we have a drop to drink. We have the Glen Owen lecture at 5:30 right here. Be here as well. Founders Day service begins at 9:30 on Friday. And of course, those students who left us 20 years ago, that batch, will be here to celebrate. Let's mingle with them. And I'm hoping I remember some of those faces, yes? Now, for today's presentation, we have a seminar that is titled Resisting Anti-Black Education and Pedagogy in the Shaping of the Jamaican People. Are you thinking revolutionary? Are you thinking scintillating? Are you thinking rebranding? Are you thinking reimagining? Let's wait and see what happens. But let me introduce to you our presenter, Professor Clinton Hutton, CD, PhD. He's the director of the Institute of Technological and Educational Research, same thing we call ITER, at the Mico University College, and a distinguished scholar at the P.J. Patterson Center for African Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies, Mona. He's a retired professor of Caribbean political philosophy, culture, and aesthetics at the University of the West Indies. He's an award-winning researcher and author with a distinguished record of research and publications, including 4 books, numerous book chapters, and journal articles, and hundreds of works of an artistic nature. You'd have seen him clicking away. Professor Hutton has made over 100 conference presentations, and has initiated and organized many conferences, symposia, and research projects. His research interests span the culture of enslaved Africans, African Caribbean spirituality, Caribbean revolutions and grassroots movements, freedom, Caribbean art and aesthetics, Jamaican popular music, masculinity, and Caribbean political philosophy and education. He has lectured on Caribbean philosophy, including Garveyism, culture, art, aesthetics, and spirituality, Jamaican popular music, the Haitian Revolution, slavery and freedom, Caribbean grassroots political movement, and education. Clinton Hutton is a noted painter and photographer. Nationally, he has been made Commander of the Order of Distinction for his contribution to culture and education. He has received a Mico Millennium Award, as well as the MOSA Gold Medal Award. Let us robustly welcome this distinguished alumnus of the Mico, who clearly embodies our motto, do it with your might. And listen actively, hold on, listen actively and critically. There will be a question and answer session for your further participation. Do enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you very much. I've been coming to this place a long while ago. I used to come here as a student in this room. Looks the same way. The same tiles in the roof. Anyway. Yes. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, and a distinguished Miconian, Mr. Trevor Thomas, coming to visit us. Greetings, everyone. I'm going to talk, the title of my presentation is across there, and you have heard it. And so I'm going to go through it because education is a thing. Theorizing education, looking at the role of education, issues relating to policies in education, is that these are very important. So what I'll do is look at education during slavery and the first 30 years of emancipation in Jamaica, right? And hopefully I am building up to go through the entire period up into the 21st century in other lectures, all right? Okay. When slavery formally ended in Jamaica in 1838, over 300 years of Spanish, 330 years of Spanish, followed by British enslavement had elapsed. The Tainos were the first to be enslaved under the Spanish. The Spaniards thereafter brought in Africans to replace these First Nation people due to the tenuous state of their demographic viability. It was unadulterated genocide. Of these 330 years of slavery, more than 180 of them happened under the British. From 1655, the British dramatically expanded slavery and framed captive Africans and their descendants into a captive industrial agrarian type of labor force on the plantation. Some 1.3 million Africans were enslaved in Jamaica for over 11 generations, working against their will, working without pay, working and creating wealth for European slaveholders and allied investors without the possibility of passing on to their children and their children's children the fruits of their labor. When slavery ended, the black population was just 300,000. Under this condition, Africans and their descendants were unable to reproduce the black population as were the Tainos before them, which proved the genocidal nature of slavery in Jamaica. To maintain slavery, the enslavers and the authorities of the British colonial slave state carried out measures guided by principles pretty much in the way stipulated by slaveholder and historian and member of parliament, Brian Edwards, who was a slaveholder in Jamaica. Edwards, who partially grew up in Jamaica, asserted that, quote unquote, in countries where slavery is established, the leading principle on which the government is supported is fair, or a sense of that absolute coercive necessity, which, leaving no choice of action, supersedes all questions of right. It is vain to deny that such actually is and necessarily must be the case in all countries where slavery is allowed. That's a slaveholder in Jamaica. In this order, the treatment of the victim of enslavement had nothing to do with his or her guilt or innocence, but everything to do with the will of the person wielding the power of ownership over him or her within a state created for that purpose. And in this state of deliberate manufactured fear, where slavery and its maintenance superseded all questions of right, one overseer from the Bybrook estate near Spanish Town described the choreographed killing by fire of an enslaved man for rebellion in 1678. The overseer said that the man's, quote unquote, legs and arms were broken in pieces with stakes, after which he was fastened upon his back to the ground. A fire was made first to his feet and burned up by degrees. I heard him speak several words when the fire consumed all his lower parts as far as his navel. The fire was upon his breast. He was burning near 3 hours before he died. Meanwhile, on May 26, 1756, in Egypt, in Westmoreland, Darby, an enslaved man, was seen by another enslaved man, Port Royal, eating sugarcane and reported him to their owner, Thomas Thistlewood. For allegedly eating the cane which this man was accused of, he was compelled to produce, which he was compelled to produce without compensation. By the way, enslaved Africans were very, very hungry. That's for a different issue, but I've done research on that across the Caribbean, and North America, and South America. So they used to eat cane because they didn't have any food, and it was a crime to do so. The cane that you plant without compensation. And in fact, they used to make some masks, metal masks, to put over their faces so they couldn't eat the cane and close it up, right? You might see some drawings of those. So, what was ordered done to this man by his quote-unquote master? And this is what Thomas Thistlewood wrote in his diary about what he ordered done to this man. Quote unquote, had him well flogged and pickled, then made Hector shit in his mouth. By July that same year, Port Royal, who apparently could not take the strain of slavery that he tried to mediate by reporting Derby, ran away and was caught. Thistlewood had him punished and entered into his diary the following: gave him a moderate whipping, pickled him well, and made Hector shit in his mouth. Immediately put in a gag whilst his mouth was full, and made him wear it 4 or 5 hours. And it was not just in Jamaica that this thing was happening. In Haiti, for example, in my research, one of the advisor to one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, who became a leader of the Haitian state, Henri Christophe, who was the head of state, his advisor wrote, and amongst other things, said that the French forced them to, quote unquote, eat human shit. In her 1903 book, Jamaica as It Is, 1903, travel author B. Pullenbury noted the following about a torturous cage of death on display at the Institute and Library of Kingston, now called the Institute of Jamaica and the National Library of Jamaica. In the museum, which is attached to the Institute and Library, a gruesome relic is exhibited. It represents an iron cage and was unearthed some years ago in the parish of St. Andrews. It encloses the bones of a woman and is constructed so as to fit the human body, with bronze around the neck, breast, and loins. There are bars to confine the legs and stirrups to the feet, which have sharp pikes to press into the soles of the occupant's feet. There is a ring at the top of the structure to suspend the gibbets. So what happened is that the person in that condition literally starved to death. Or in fact, first of all, might die because of lack of water. Right? And if it is raining, then the person might live a little longer. But he's left, or she's left, to hang there from a tree or whatever else, and the person slowly died from starvation. Huh? So all these things were done to protect slavery. But it happens across the Caribbean. So, for example, in Jamaica, castration, the surgical removal of the male genitalia, the testicles, but often everything, was very common in Jamaica. And sometimes very common for simple things, simple infraction. And I have studied castrations across the Americas where Africans were enslaved, and in the United States it was a particular special type of institution. But we can't go into all of these things. We don't have the time to do so. I've written about them. But one of the purpose of castrating men, the way they put it, was to turn them into women. Because the slave holding class saw men as the political force, not women, saw men as the political force. And they figured that if they castrate them, they turn them into a non-political entity. Right? So that was very common in Jamaica. It was in Barbados as well. I mean, in Barbados, for example, there's quite a graphic illustration of this castration taking place, where the governor at the time, 1764, Governor Pinfold, ordered that this man be chained to an iron stake to be fixed for that purpose, that his privy members be cut off and burned before his face, and that afterwards he be burned alive, that the whole carcass be reduced to ashes, and those ashes dispersed in the air, that no part of such a villain may remain, and that the whole execution may be performed with such solemnity that it may strike the spectators with the greatest awe and terror. Punishment was not for the victims. Punishment was for those who were forced to witness these, and that was very common. We call it exemplary punishment, punishment by example, to teach not the victim, but to teach those not to cross the line, or this is what will happen to you. Right. Okay. So I am going through and leaving out stuff. But probably just let us finish one last one. The torture started on the Atlantic Ocean coming across, where actually some 6 million enslaved Africans died on the way to the Americas. Some 6 million, right? And some 4 to 6 million died in the wars that were waged to capture people, to enslave them, right? So on the way over in this particular case, this eyewitness on this slave ship, or a slaver, as they are called, quoting him now, to strike fear that the captain of that ship, to strike fear in the rest, killed a slave and dividing heart, liver, and entrails into 300 pieces, made each of the slaves eat one, threatening those who refused with the same torture. Then he went on to say, such incidents were not rare. Right? So this is slavery, over 330 years, to create wealth for Europe. The banking sector, the manufacturing sector, the educational institutions, the universities that were built by profit produced by captive labor. The infrastructure of Europe was built on enslaving Africans, selling them, making profit. Specifically, for example, 2 slave traders developed Lloyd of London. Lloyd of London is still one of the biggest insurance companies. The principal founders of Lloyd's of London were traffickers of Africans, and they used the profit from it to support, to found that institution. The same thing with Barclays Bank. And that's it. The superstructure and structure of Europe was built primarily on this form of thing, system spanning 4 centuries. So, all of these things that I've just described to you, they did not happen thoughtlessly. They did not happen without thought. They did not happen without contemplation. Right? So I'm going into the realm of education. Right? So the fear that these measures were taken to instill in the enslaved so that they said, okay, we can't do better. What's the use resisting? Those measures of instilling fear was not just about being fearful of the pain, the horror, the dystopia reigned on those people. That's why we are here today in the classroom here. There's no wall that separates us from our forebearers. And the best way to honor our forebearers is to know their history, to know their culture, prior to their enslavement and during their enslavement, if we are to appreciate why we are here today. All right? So it's important for us to know that. So the fear, therefore, that was instilled was not just a fear for being tortured, being burned to death, being castrated. It was a fear for whiteness. A fear for or of whiteness. In fact, not just an ordinary fear, a deifical fear, a godlike fear for those who have inflicted these measures on them. Now, one slaveholder in Martinique, he was a colonial civil servant for the French. He was an author as well. He partially grew up there too. He made a statement which is this, quote unquote, policy and safety require that we crush the race of blacks by a contempt so great that whoever descends from it, even to the 6th generation, shall be covered with an indelible stain. The purpose of the violence, the purpose of the desecration of the black body was for blacks to be so stained in their mental consciousness, in their existential conceptions of themselves, that they would perpetuate slavery by themselves for 6 generations to come. They themselves would perpetuate slavery. And we will see later on that this concept that we are talking about, that this stain, is what Marcus Garvey called mental slavery. And what in Paul Bogle's time was called black skin, white heart. And if you know the more recent version, most of you probably have the American version about the Oreo cookie, which we call in Jamaica roast breadfruit. Right? We need to understand these things. All right, good. So, a governor of Martinique now, 18th century, wasn't really in sync with that colonial civil servant, also in Martinique, because this governor stated that, quote, unquote, the safety of whites demands that we keep the Negroes in the most profound ignorance. I have reached the stage of believing firmly that one must treat Negroes as one treats beasts. So these people were very conscious of what they were doing. They were conscious that if you desecrate people, you will keep them under your thumb. They were very conscious. And therefore, the literature that tells us today that, oh, it was just during those times, people never knew better. That's what the literature is saying a lot of the time. We must understand that these people were doing these measures and performing them and choreographing them, that they knew exactly what they were aiming for. So, what the above two statements suggest is that the European slaveholders were consciously aware of the humanity of Africans and deliberately set out to make them chattel by appropriating their existence in what Frederick Douglass, and that was an enslaved man born in the United States, what Frederick Douglass called the intense criminality of the slaveholders. And since the slaveholders were conscious that they were engaged in the colossus violation of African existence, they had to create mythologies, narratives of lies, a superstructural architecture located in a lifelong activist system of education to convince everyone of the righteousness of slavery and its perpetuation. In this respect, every social, political, economic system has its requisite education system to justify its existence and ensure the cooperation and consent of its contradictory elements in the order of things. It is within this context that the following statement by Pierre Dessalles, a French slaveholder in Martinique, must be seen. He noted that, quote, the Negro race is so uncivilizable, so lazy, that it would completely be impossible to obtain the least work from them without the fear of some punishment. Furthermore, he said, if we deprive the master, I don't know who made them master. He's assuming that some people are masters and some are the opposite to that. Right? If we deprive the master of the ability to repress by himself the daily faults of the Negro, which he does only in the least extremity, which is like this castration, the least extremity, it will bring insubordination and disorder. Dessalles further stated that the Negro is naturally hateful and wicked, superstitious and unprincipled. He never hesitates to take vengeance. Remember that these people were in their yard? Way back over so? Never called anybody. Never went to Europe because they were hungry. Right? And now you took them and do all of these things to them and say, you know, these people are vengeful people. They are inherently vengeful. Right? Oh, okay. So, in his system, Dessalles' system of ideas, which framed his philosophy of being, the African was deemed to be uncivilized in his natural state. Indeed, the African was naturally resistant to being civilized due to his inherent daily faults. That is to say, he cannot exist in the state of nature on his own accord. Neither can he exist outside the state of nature, that is the state of man, without the supervision of the European, whose agency was required to remove the African from the state of nature in the first place. The logic here is that the freedom for the African could only mean one thing. That is, that that freedom for him, according to the slaveholder, can only be freedom from himself. Not freedom from the Europeans. Freedom from himself. Freedom from his wickedness. Freedom from his vengefulness. Freedom from his enormous sensuous will. Freedom from his ignorance. That's what freedom should mean. And therefore, enslaved people who struggled to remove slavery and the colonial period after, that the worst of things should be done to them, because they are really struggling against what is best in life. And what is best for them in life is to serve Europeans. That's how they get their humanity. Right? Okay. Elsewhere, we see in the first encyclopedia, the first American edition of Encyclopedia Britannica, 1798. It is stated in part in a description of the enslaved person that, having described the physicality of black people, went on to say that within this type of body that I have just described, vices, the most notorious, seem to be the portion of this unhappy race. Idleness, treachery, revenge, cruelty, impudence, stealing, lying, profanity, debauchery, nastiness, and intemperance are said to have extinguished the principle of natural law and to have silenced the reproofs of conscience. They are strangers to every sentiment of compassion and are an awful example of the corruption of man when left to himself. Right? So the point is, we are talking about anti-black racism. That's what we're talking about. That system which is central to what scholars call white supremacy. White supremacy, even when it is white supremacy over East Indian or Chinese or non-Europeans, was built around the center pole of hating black people. That's how it developed, right? Okay, and so the most eminent European philosophers were involved in the creation of this racism. So, for example, Immanuel Kant, German classical philosopher, born 1724, died 1804, spoke about the intellectual superiority of white people over black people by making this type of statement, quote unquote. This fellow was quite black from head to foot. A clear proof that what he said was stupid. Now, you are required to do your assignment, and you have to have proof for whatever statement you are going to make. Now, this man with his PhD doesn't have to know this person personally to say what he is. Right? Within black skin and certain texture here is stupidity. So this person was black from head to foot. Clear proof that what he said was stupid. Right? And therefore, black people are arbitrarily irrational. And if you are irrational, you are illogical. Right? You don't make sense. This is the education, right, that they try to get black people to believe in. Right? And this is the type of thing that they build policy from. All right. So, when one Francis Williams, born about 1697, died 1762, a free black, son of John and Dorothy Williams, who were free people in Jamaica, in Spanish Town, was sent to study in England on the basis of trying to prove or disprove the intellectual superiority or inferiority of blacks, or whether they were equal in thought and in mental capacity. Right? And he was sent to one of the best British schools, high schools. And after that, he was sent to the University of Cambridge, where he excelled in Cambridge and excelled prior to that in high school. So this is a now man with a degree sent back to Jamaica. Well, David Hume, the British philosopher and economist during that time, never had to know him. This is a statement. This is a statement. David Hume made this statement, like many of his colleagues. I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general, all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or in speculation. No ingenious manufacturers amongst them, no arts, no successes. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans and the present Tartars, have still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages. And if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. Not to mention our colonies. There are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of whom none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. Though low white people without education will start up amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning. But it is likely he is admired for slender accomplishment. He's talking about Williams. Like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. So this man went to their university and beat them in their university. But then you have to diminish him. Right? So even when you see his accomplishments, you have to diminish him. What you are seeing is not really what you are seeing. Right? So, in 1884, 1834 to 1838 was a period known in Jamaica as what? Apprenticeship. Apprenticeship was still slavery, but it was a transitional point from that to full freedom. Right? So this period, in this period, the Mico Charity Fund was established. In 1835, the trustees sent Reverend J.M. Chu, Secretary of the Trustee Board, and the first group of teachers to Jamaica. 1836, buildings were erected at Hanover Street in Kingston. There was a boys' school and a girls' school. They were erected and opened there. In fact, there was also an infant school. So infant education began a long while ago, you know. It's not a 20th century thing. It happened a long while ago. Infant school, and there was also a Sunday school and an evening school. These were also erected. By 1836, the normal school, as the training college was called then, started. One source, we have to try to find out which is the right source. One source stated that it started with 3 students, a female and 2 males. Another source says 10, 7 female and 3 males. All right? But whatever the truth of that is, which we will be able to find out, whatever the truth of that is, the fact of the matter is that Mico began as a co-educational institution in 1836. Right? But shortly thereafter, the grants on primary schools were done away with. And so as a result of that, the Mico Trust focused on training teachers alone. Right? During slavery, several schools were established in Jamaica. Woolmer's in 1729, Manning's in 1738, St. Jago in 1744, Rossi's in 1777, Titchfield in 1786, and Jamaica College in 1789. These schools were made for the children of whites who were unable to send their children to school in Britain. And more should be done in looking at these schools, in the earlier period of these schools, which get transformed when Jamaicans were in charge, right? And have done well. So these schools were established to accommodate poor whites, mainly boys. All right? So the first report in the era of the emerging emancipation in relation to education and educational policy was penned by Reverend John Sterling, and it's called the Sterling Report. And essentially, what you get is what type of education should the recently freed Africans get. Sterling was for emancipation. Sterling was a liberal, but Sterling's prescription was that black people should be taught to use their hands and minds to become better laborers. Right? That was his solution. Right? In 1838, August 17, that is 16 days after formal emancipation came, an essay titled "A Few Hints on the Negro Character" was published in the Jamaica Dispatch and Kingston Chronicle. That was a newspaper then, framing the perimeter for labor and capital. Labor appears to the African, and this is, I'm quoting what this essay says in this newspaper. Labor appears to the African the greatest curse on earth. Nor do I believe cultivation will continue. These people don't cultivate. They capture people to cultivate. To plant crops that are tropical crops that people have the expertise in. Expertise in growing rice, tobacco, coffee, which is birthplace is Ethiopia, all of these things. And then saying that these people don't cultivate. You see how this story goes? Right? That they are lazy inherently. So labor appears to the African the greatest curse on earth. Nor do I believe cultivation will continue unless laws are made to enforce a due obedience on the part of Negroes to do their duty. And these laws must not be administered by individuals possessing no property in the country. Such men have, and they will again render laws useless by an outright administration, unjust administration of them. Besides, they are unacquainted with the Negro character and act towards him as if he were a Cockney, a black Cockney in London. According to this newspaper, quote unquote, the Negro requires to be constantly followed up. A special type of supervision that only white people can do. Must be constantly followed up. Driver, he must have. Earlier in 1838, another newspaper, the West Indian, stated that one of its main aims was to, quote, put within the reach of the laboring population the means of acquiring such information to make contented laborers. So the purpose of education is to make the black people contented laborers. The role of education is to make the people who were subordinated contented laborers. The paper also favored the paper also printed a classical example of the favored philosophy of education and pedagogy for emancipation, education, and of which was really predicated on the old slave model, right? Which continues after, because the slave-holding class was not overthrown. They did not lose their ability. They lose their ability to own people, but they still control the country. They still control the government. They still control everything, right? So this is what is in his newspaper. The type of education that they got, Africans got during slavery, but which is scheduled to continue after slavery. Quote unquote, the honor of a servant is his fidelity. His highest virtues are submission and obedience. Be patient, therefore, under the reproofs of thy master, and when he rebuketh thee, answer not again. The silence of thy resignation shall not be forgotten. Be studious of his interest. Be diligent in his affairs, and faithful to the trust which he reposeth in thee. Thy time and thy labor belong to him. Defraud him not thereof. Right? So this is a slavery form of education, but it is being said now when slavery was abolished that this education must continue without the slave masters. But in all of this form of education, the black population in resisting, because they did resist this form of education. They did. They resisted this form of education. And in 1865, there was a man called George Price. George Price was the first black person to be elected to the Jamaican Parliament, then called it the House of Assembly. He was in the courthouse at Stony Gut, at Morant Bay, when it was assaulted by Paul Bogle and his people on October 11, 1865. And the people confronted him. And when they confronted him, they asked him a number of questions. One, aren't you black? Isn't your wife black? So what are you doing supporting those people in the courthouse? Right? And in fact, they actually killed him. Right? In fact, when they finished questioning him, they raised a point, and it's the first I've seen it in the literature, that you have black skin and white heart. That's what it told him on October 11, 1865. Right? So, what is this? Let us get another example of this. Justina, a black woman in Jamaica, and that is long after this, but it's still in 1895. But to show you where this thing is coming from, if that was said in 1865, it means it existed. That concept existed before 1865, right? So a woman named Alice Spinner, a British woman, came to Jamaica and wrote a novel called A Study in Color. And she cited in her conversation with one Justina, a black woman, a maid. And she was telling the woman what kind of baby she would like to have when she started to having children. And I'm quoting her. I never could love a black little child same as I do the white. I worship the little master, and if I lucky, even I may have a fair child one day. No, but not, of course, a real white one. That's asking too much. But still, one that is almost white. And then I worship it and work for it to true. Dress it up nicely too, in clean clothes, with shoes and all, just like a Bakra baby. You shall see, Missus, one day, how nice I keep it when it comes, if it is fair. Right? Of course, we hear those things in the 20th century, and we hear them in the 21st century. Right? So, so one of the biggest problems in education and the philosophy of education in Jamaica was the idea that black people, a countervailing idea, a resistant idea, that black people, some black people, were mentally enslaved. And that this ought to be taken into consideration whenever you're struggling for freedom or whatever you're struggling for. That you cannot allow the prevailing idea to supersede, but you must fight that prevailing idea which says Europeans are the best thing since sliced bread, intellectually and otherwise. Right? Okay. So we are running down. In the Paul Bogle movement, there was a slogan in 1865, and that slogan is liberty of person, liberty of land. Liberty of person, liberty of land. That is to say, you can't just free us from slavery after working for 330 odd years without anything, which is what they did. Right? And therefore, for us to be really free, we must have the ability to make our own living on our own steam. So that what we see here is a profound description of freedom. That a person is only really free if he has the ability to make his own living. Right? There's a song done by the Wailers, written by Marley, called Slave Driver. And it says in part, every time I hear the crack of the whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized our very soul. Today, they say we are free, only to be chained to poverty. The same poverty of 330 odd years. And that you have to change the equation. You cannot have you cannot have freedom if the system remains entrenched in the structure that it was built. Then we come to John Willis Menard. So we are seeing ways of counteracting. John Willis Menard was an American. He was sent by the Abraham Lincoln administration in the United States at the time when the Civil War was still going, to go to what is now called Belize, which was then British Honduras. They went there to see to the availability of land to settle black people. Because Abraham Lincoln was of the view that the reason why white people are fighting amongst themselves was because of black people here. And therefore, the best thing to do is to send them out of the country. It never finally happened, but that was the thought why John Willis Menard was sent to Belize, or British Honduras. It happened that when he was going back to the United States, he stopped over in Jamaica. 26 years old, met a 19-year-old woman, fell in love, went up to the United States, came back to Jamaica and married her. Right? In Jamaica, John Willis Menard wrote a series of articles in the Sentinel newspaper called Popular Education. And what I will do, without even trying to assess, is to just quote fairly lengthy some of the ideas that he spoke of about popular education. In other words, he was putting an alternative education system, as was his friend Samuel Clark, where he stayed in Jamaica. And Samuel Clark's brother was married to Paul Bogle's daughter. His brother, George, was married to Paul Bogle's daughter, Elizabeth. They had 2 children. And Samuel Clark was executed during the Morant Bay Rebellion by the British. Right? So, Menard and education. The happiness and prosperity of a nation depends not on its mineral wealth, largeness of population, but mainly upon the intelligence of the great mass of its people. Not saying a few. We're just coming out 27 years out of emancipation. He's saying that the education that one should get should be popular and it should embrace not just the adult population, but the children's population. All persons should be educated. So he was talking about education as the basis for citizenship, right? So he therefore says that the happiness and prosperity of a nation depends not on its mineral wealth, largest of population, but mainly upon the intelligence of the great mass of its people. Without the latter, the former will forever sleep undisturbed in the dark domains of blissful ignorance. See, remember it sound good? He was also a noted poet, right? It has been said by some, this is another quote, it has been said by some who boast of their physiological and phenological research that extreme climate is unfavorable to the spread of civilization, that a full development of the reasoning faculty can only take place where physical circumstances conspire, that the human race is indebted to the climate of England and France for the intellect of Newton and Lepage. This argument may be admissible in modern times, but the experience of history teaches it could not be held true with regard to the ancient world, whose civilization was nurtured under the benign influences of the tropical sun. An investigation of the physical circumstances would most surely settle the fact that civilization in its highest order is not the result of an innate superiority of any portion of the human race. So one of the things he was advocating here, all people are equal and they have equal ability intellectually. And went further to say that the history of the world and of education and of achievement did not begin in Europe. It began in the tropical space, in the Egypts, in China, in India, which is true, which is absolutely true, right? And therefore, his argument for how you would shape the philosophy of education and pedagogy. Very important, right? Which is still relevant today, by the way. So, all right. I won't cite him anymore. I have more, but I won't go that way. But safe to say that the statements that he made, you would think that he's a 21st century man. I mean, it's amazing, right? Okay, but we're not going to go through it. We are closing up, and two men came to Jamaica in 1866, just after the Morant Bay Uprising of 1865, and they toured the country. And they wrote about the schools that they visited in 1866. And they did a report. And the report is in the form of a book. Right? And in one of the appendices, he noted this. Number 9, they noted this. Number 9, Elsie Anderson, Coley Village. Church, didn't say what church she went to. Widow of James, who died 11 years ago. Her house and everything in it burnt, and much coffee destroyed by the white soldiers. Her only son is being trained in the Mico institution as day school teacher, and every shilling she managed to get, she is obliged to send it away to him. And these two persons gave her £1, 10 shillings. Huh? That is Thomas Harvey and William Brewin. Another thing that they have in the same thing is number 15, Jan Cummins from Somerset Village, Baptist widow of Benjamin, who died 4 years ago. Her house and furniture were burnt by white soldiers, coffee picked in and taken away by order of Mr. Joseph. She has 6 children and is very destitute. Sorry, gee. Sorry, I should have turned off this phone. Right? So can shut it off. So if somebody here turn off or something, why them calling back? If they hear, turn it off. It's like they try to defy you. You turn off something and never call you again. Okay. But who was this Mr. Joseph who ordered the picking of her and the selling of her coffee? Mr. Joseph was a teacher. He was a master, a school master in Morant Bay. He was a schoolmaster in Morant Bay. There's a picture. He was a schoolmaster. That's him. That's Mr. Joseph. He was a schoolmaster in Morant Bay, and he was in the courthouse when it was attacked by Paul Bogle's people. And he was employed. He said he escaped from the place and ran quarter mile to the house of a Wesleyan schoolmaster and stayed there. But there's a lot of description of what happened from him. But as well as information about where he was trained as a teacher, who his parents were. His father was from Africa, taken here into slavery. But this man was then employed by the man following him, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, Colonel Thomas Hobbes. This man is one of the wickedest men. This man executed many people in St. Thomas in the East. And when he was going back to England, you know what he did? He jumped overboard and drowned himself. Thomas Hobbes employed Mr. Matthew Joseph to sell the people coffee and other things. They belong to the rebels, so we seize them and we sell them. And even a copy of one of the receipts we had, but Mr. Joseph later on in life had a son who graduated from Mico and then went on to do law and then did serious practice, I think, in the Bahamas. Well loved, but he died at about age 42. He died young, right? So these are some of the issues relating to education. And education, finally, education does not exist solely in the formal sense. In fact, education exists more informally, right? So it doesn't mean that one is superior than the other. And certainly the formal system has a lot to learn. From the informal system, right? Every day, people were enslaved or otherwise suppressed. They were told that they were nothing. Until people like Bogle, people like Garvey, pick up the thing and started a different form of philosophy of education and a different way of teaching, right? The pedagogy of self-respect. All of those things, right? So thank you very much. Yes. So, any question?
Yes, sir. Insightful presentation. With all of what you have said, sir, and with all of what is going on in Florida and the woke agenda and all of those nice things, what is our role as teacher educators and the teacher training institutions in progressing this agenda of culturally responsive teaching?
Okay, so the first thing we should do is to teach. When we are training our teachers, that we begin to reflect some of these in teacher training. Because some of our teachers perpetuate the colonial education amongst our children and favor some children over others because of where they are from. Right? And therefore, the teachers are extremely important, not being paid enough. And they should be paid. But teachers are extremely important to cut down, this is 60 years of independence, but to cut down the type of education that still mired us into obscurity. Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that teachers, for me, your biggest task is to help the student to develop his or her capacity for self-education, for self-directed learning. That is to say, education ought to be a lifelong project. And if it is going to be a lifelong project, you must develop your capacity to teach yourself to learn. Right? You must develop your capacity to learn, to love to read, to love to analyze critically. Right? Not to just see things and to say, well, that's the state of things. You must question the state of things. Even if it's something you support, you must question the state of things. And the teacher, the teacher, including myself, the teacher is our role is to facilitate the students to do those things. Right? And the other things you need to recognize that we have to teach boys differently from girls. Right? And education ought to become an adventure, not a burden. Some people see that as a burden. Ask somebody to come to a lecture. Sir, you're going to come on the exam paper? And you hear things like, sir, you mark hard. Look, man, it is by going through the process. There's a saying in Jamaica, patient man ride donkey. Patient man rides donkey is saying that there is a process. Right? Some people don't like the process. What they want is the result without going through the process. But it is the process that gives you character and shaped you. It is a process of doing these things that shape you. And therefore, sometimes process is more important than the result. It is the shaping of your character, the shaping of your sense of self. Right? Okay.
Standardized testing and so on. And the way teachers are really pressured to produce good exam results. It's going to take a lot of effort on the part of the policymakers to recognize that with so much pressure being put on the teacher to produce in terms of results and standardized tests, some of the things that you are presenting now that should be done. Can that be done?
Yeah. I don't believe in standardized
Because
tests. I believe in tests, but I don't necessarily believe that the students should work towards just tests.
Right. So teachers are just going through the motions of teaching to the test.
Yeah.
And some of the values and the attitudes and those things that we should be developing among our students are shared.
Yes. The thing that will make the student a sovereign learner.
Yes.
We are missing that. Right? And that is where the power of education is. Your ability to teach yourself to learn. And there are many reasons for that. The education system has problems philosophically, as you would have heard from thing. And your ability to therefore go and see opinion in books and in conferences, whether they are dealing with your issues or not. You should attend conferences. Whether the conference is about your specific subject area, it doesn't matter. You should attend conferences. And because conferences are important for many things, including making your discipline more focused. The broader education you have is better for your specific discipline. Right? So it's important. Well, I mean, while I was teaching at UWI, I use part of my lecture to just talk about common things. I don't go through the 1 hour of lecture. We talk about things. Let me tell you something. I did not go to a high school. I taught myself. I sent to the offices near to Mico. I wouldn't even know that. But I sent up for London University O-levels and A-levels based on what I did for myself. Right? My friends are older people. My father was born in 1893. My mother was born in 1931. My first sibling was born in 1915. When my father was in his bar and shop at nights, I, as a little boy, 4 or 5 years old, sat down under the counter, listening to those men who were born in the late 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, talking. I couldn't miss it. That's why I like older people. I have so much things to learn from them. And the other thing is that, I mean, I learned so much from my father, but the other thing is that a teacher ought to be a good storyteller. If you want to hold your students, you need to become a master storyteller in your subject area and in other subjects so that you are able to weave this picture in front of your students like a movie. So that the issue that I spoke about earlier, that learning should be an adventure. It really should be. Learning is not something you do to get a job. It is important, but it is much more than that. Learning to make you a better human being. Learning to make you question things. Learning to develop your ability to see your creative spirit and to use that type of creative agency to do what you need to do to be a better human being by just learning and just learning and learning.
One moment, please. I have a hand up there.
Yes.
And I can... Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Professor. As you know, I am a fan, and I am a student of history like yourself. It is easy for me, for example, to see how you regularly integrate the things you are talking about into the kind of subject area that I teach and you teach, history and so on and so forth. But when you think of math, for example, and I can see educational philosophy and framework in that. But when you talk about mathematical pedagogy, what does all of what you have to say have to do with any of that?
Oh.
You know, for the students who are sitting here and are perhaps wondering, okay, so how do I put all of this morantly and all of these things into mathematical pedagogy. What does that have to do with anything, you know? So sometimes the broader picture, it's very important and so on. But when it comes down to it in the classroom with the subject area, that is not necessarily so obviously connected to what you are saying. I notice I'm saying, not necessarily so obviously connected. How is it that you allow someone to understand, both the lecturer and I'm just using math as an example of math, and the student teachers to have that kind of understanding of how we integrate that kind of pedagogy, which is a broader kind of pedagogy, into the teaching learning of math, for example.
Yes, you need a good teacher as a guide. And many people who have become very important people in life, they can point to a teacher or two who was central to their development. In my case, it was the best thing ever happened to me at Mico was Professor Errol Miller. That's the best thing ever happened to me. Right? And to do one thing, something called Principal Hour. I could never miss it. Right? So that is important. The guidance from a teacher, and the teacher need not be a formal teacher. The guidance is very important to do, and having done that, at all times is how the person, you need to, as Marley said in a song, open your eyes and look within. Are you satisfied with the way you are living? You really have to open your eyes and take charge of yourself, right? So it is not just left on the teacher alone. You have responsibilities. You have pedagogical responsibilities and philosophical responsibilities. And some of the easiest things, simplest things, can express some of the most profound things. Yeah.
One moment though. We have 3 persons only to go. Yes? We have a student there, Mrs. Summersworth and Mr. President.
Okay, for me, my name is Dwayne, I'm a physics major. What are some of the policies that you think is lacking in the government of Jamaica?
Well, in most governments that we have had, the policy is twofold. The policy is, what do you do for education? Education is the most important function of our development right now, and has been so since '62. The most important. The amount of taxes that I paid somebody coming from poverty, tie out goat every morning, have a home sweet home lamp, working from, reading throughout the night. And it's when I come to Mico and go in the study room and Mills Hall as a Rajahite. I mean, the thing was the light was so bright. And then when I went back on holidays and sat around the lamp, it's the first time I realized, the lamp was so hot. I never knew. Right? But the one thing that all of us need to cultivate is something called self-motivation. It's absolutely important. Self-motivation. Sometimes we sell ourselves short because we don't believe in ourselves enough, and in our capacity enough. And there are some things where, I mean, look, man, you're being complimented, and it's part of our history right in the moment. You're being complimented as a woman. Boy, you know you look good for a black girl. You really look good for a black girl. And sometimes we put up with those foolishness. Right? So that education is not reading, writing, and arithmetic. Education is much broader than that. right? And even with reading, writing, and arithmetic, I remember my son going to Campion, and very good at math. But when I look at his math thing, you would believe that maths is a European thing. There were no maths in Europe before Egypt, before India, and before China. And some of the most important mathematical family came out of those experiences. So if you are going to do maths, you cannot do maths, but the way you're taught, you by yourself came to the conclusion that maths is European. Right? And this is why, for example, it's important when you're talking about inventions, you name who, what race of people do it. Because if you don't, you will automatically, based on our history, think that that invention must be a white person invented it. Which is not true. Some of the most important inventions in the world today were done by people other than white people.
Thank you, sir. We have about 3 minutes to go. This is Summer's line.
I was just commenting on the point, that last point that you made. It is the how we teach is very important in advancing this agenda, because as you just mentioned, many of our pedagogical approaches and what we teach, how we teach, is European in nature, and we still have that mindset that white is always right and what they say. We are only attracted to webinars if someone is white on the panel. And so as teachers and teacher training institutions, we need to perhaps reframe how some of these theories and methods and practices are presented, because the student teachers cannot perpetuate anything different than what they were taught or how they were trained. And I think it's very important for us to consider.
Yep.
Thank you. Thomas, is that the one?
I'm a graduate class of 62.
Wow.
60 years. My father was born in 1902, and his grandfather was a slave. So it makes my great-grandfather a slave. Now, my mother was an elementary school dropout, so she was sort of functionally literate, but that was about all. My father was a carpenter, because that was what he was meant to be, right? So you have a mother who, she can barely make it read and write it. You have a father who's a carpenter. But then we have got people like Edwin Allen, who graduated from this institution in the 40s, right? And he was determined to make sure that we could get an education, not a schooling, because the schooling was being administered by the British and it was meant to subjugate us. The Emancipation Proclamation was not emancipation, it was emancipation. You need to read it carefully, and you can see that we were meant to be laborers, not owning anything. And it says you must work twice, I have it from here, you must work twice as hard to make the island prosperous. It's not your prosperity, it's the prosperity of your owner, right? Remember, you don't own anything, so you're going to have to go back to where you came from, and you're going to have to pay for you're going to have to pay rent, either by way of money or by way of your labor. Right? So when you look at that whole proclamation, you see it was not emancipation, it was emancipation. Now, Edwin Allen put together, listen to this, a class in this very campus, on this very campus. In 1955, I entered that class because I was not meant to get an education, but a graduate called Edwin Allen, who also had the New Deal, which he did in 1962 going forward, and all of the junior secondary schools that you see now are either built by him or, as a part of his grand plan, right? So a lot of the infrastructure you see now belongs to him. But for 5 years, I sat and ended up in that pavilion. The pavilion is my shrine. Because nobody knows too much about that class. I ended up with 5 GCE O levels and passed the so-called senior Cambridge at grade 1. In 1960, I entered this institution, and in 18 months, I walked away at 19 years old with my teacher's certificate. So you can see what we're talking about, making sure that black people got an education. So I've been a part of the process. I have lived the process. And I'm eternally grateful. I spent 7 years on this campus. 7 years, 5 years doing the sort of learning for secondary education, and another 2 years in the teachers. So it was 7 years that I'm eternally grateful for, right? And this is why, this place is sacred to me, especially that clock shop at the That is my shrine. Thank you.
For those who came in late, that's Mr. Trevor Thomas, the Chief Operating Officer of the Mico University College Foundation of America. He's here on special visit. Clap him again. And our president will close the floor.
Oh, yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We firstly thank Prof. And Mr. Fernando. Audience, so many persons here at this time. Truly impressed. Thank you so much. I was really going to respond to my colleague's question regarding the implications of pedagogy and what you were saying. And one of the first things I learned as a young teacher is that confidence is critical and important. You walk into a classroom and don't show confidence, nobody will get it.
No respect.
Prof was talking about knowing your history, where you're coming from, know where you're going. Develop this self-confidence and self-determination, God will bless you. And then, that's the foundation of anything you want to teach, whether it's maths, English, or history. However, I also spoke about understanding and thinking, and the critical thinking, the soft skills that we're talking about today, the 21st century skills, are critical to maths, critical to English, critical to history, etc. And therefore, what he's talking about is not compartmentalization of education, but integration of everything that we do. And therefore, one of the things that I learned many years ago in my teaching as well is how to integrate concepts. So the concept revolution, for example, what Prof spoke about with the Morambe Rebellion is partly a revolution. They revolutionized the entire Jamaica government structure, the police force, education, as a result of this movement. But revolution also means a what? In maths, it means a circular, a irreversible change. Then you have geography, where the earth revolves around it. That's also revolution. And if you talk about poetry and language, then remember a man called Claude McKay, who went to Harlem and joined the Renaissance and that revolutionary era, which is poetry and his words. So therefore, what he was talking about, we can intertwine any language in it. That's good pedagogy. Thank you.
So, this is the first. Is it first in the series?
Yes, it will be the first in a series of seminars that we will do.
All right.
So, Prof, you didn't know that?
Okay. No problem. Yeah, no problem. And just to end by just citing a description of an enslaved man who was executed in 1760. He was one of the leaders of the Taki uprising in St. Mary. And therefore to ask ourselves what kind of education this man got, why he responded this way to his death. According to the eyewitness, the wretch that was burnt was made to sit on the ground, and his body being chained to an iron stake, the fire was applied to his feet. He uttered not a groan, and saw his legs reduced to ashes with the utmost firmness and composure. After which, one of his arms, by some means getting loose, he snatched a brand from the fire that was consuming him and flung it at the face of his executioner. Thank you.
No, sir. That clap is fenke fenke. Thank you. I mentioned 4 terms: revolutionary, scintillating, reimagining, rebranding. Did they come to pass? Absolutely. As we leave here this afternoon, please remember, you're an individual, you're a member of a family, you're a Jamaican, and you're an educator. Revisit your self-concept. Think about your mission. Look at your possibilities in light of today's presentation. Thank you again for coming. I'm Karen Foster, the Dean of the Faculty of Education.